Hello and welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Jackson, and it's my mission to share the science of human behaviour in a practical, fun and inspiring way. In each podcast episode, I interview an expert from the fields of psychology, well-being, leadership, parenting or high performance. I pick their brain to uncover what they know about living well, what tips do they have for you and I quiz them about how they apply their expertise in their own life. Join me as we discover simple, science-backed ways to live, learn, flourish, and fulfill your potential. Hello, welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I am the host around here. If we haven't met before, hi, I'm Ellen. I am a workplace psychologist, a mum, an occasional writer, although I must admit those occasions seem few and far between right now. And I'm also a podcaster. And I can say that now because I've been doing this for a year and it still feels weird. I'm not sure I've fully absorbed podcaster into my identity yet. Although the stats suggest that keeping a show on the air and continuing to produce new content beyond the first 12 months is really not that common, which was interesting. In fact, I discovered recently that continuing to produce content beyond about 9 episodes is unusual. And there's some estimates that suggest that more than 80% of all podcasts have not published new episodes in the past 3 months, and close to 70% have been inactive for a whole year. So there's even a name for this. It's called pod fade. Why am I talking about it? It's not to blow my own trumpet, although I am pretty proud of the fact that the team and I have kept this going and we're still going strong after 12 months. I'm actually talking about it because I've been thinking about the benefits of perspective taking. Now, in psychology, perspective taking is defined as perceiving a situation or understanding a concept from an alternative point of view. And sometimes that might be another person's point of view, so thinking about how someone else might view a situation. But often we can adjust our perspective or see a situation differently and in a more helpful way just by allowing new input in. So I might grapple with feeling like growth of the podcast is slow or not knowing whether I'm doing it right as a newbie, the kind of things that I know from my peers who have started out the last 12 months are very common thoughts and experiences. But when I read that only a small percentage of podcasts make it past their first 9 episodes and even fewer last beyond a year, that changes my perspective. And in turn, that changes the way that I feel. So instead of feeling like I'm floundering or struggling, although I still have those moments, I'm able to feel like I'm succeeding. And all that's changed is not the situation, but just the way that I think about the situation, the way I view it. So my perspective has changed. And I had a similar experience when I read today's guest's memoir. Reading her story, which we'll share with you in a moment, prompted me to ask questions like, how would I cope if I was in her situation? What would I do if I received the diagnoses that she received? How would my life be different? And would I still be worried about the same things as worry me today? And so reading her story, having that input into the system that is my mind, helped me. And it continues to help me some weeks later to really drag myself out of some of the daily worries and anxieties and to think differently about some of the things that cause me stress. So reading her story and the way that she's not only coped but thrived and continues to thrive and flourish has really given me a fresh and helpful perspective. So let's listen in, shall we? And perhaps you might like to let me know how hearing her story maybe changes your perspective. My guest today once specialised in psycho-oncology, which is the human side of cancer. And in 2010, at the age of 37, she received the terrifying news that she had not one but 2 primary breast cancers. This became for her a frightening opportunity to practice what she preaches. So the practitioner became the patient. Dr. Jodie Fleming has recounted her story in a touching memoir, A Hole in My Genes, which is Genes, because we're an audio medium here, so we need to explain it's not the jeans you wear, but Genes, published last month. And she's here to talk to us about the book, her story, and what she's learned about living with a cancer diagnosis as both a psychologist and a survivor. Welcome, Jodie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Ellen.
I have just finished your book. I've been fully immersed in it over the last few days. And it is, I call it a touching memoir because it really is. I cried. I'll put my hand up and say I cried.
Did you laugh as well?
But it wasn't sad. You know, there's nothing sad in this story. It's harrowing at times. I've had many a moment over the last couple of days where I've gone, I have no idea how she coped, but I'm going to ask you about that. But you've written it in such a lovely, light, almost, I don't want to say humorous way. It's not humorous, but it's light. You know, it's engaging. It's storytelling, and it's really beautifully written.
Well, they're some of my favourite compliments, actually. I love that you didn't find it sad. I love that it moves people, but I'm one of those people that it would absolutely terrify me to think that anybody would feel pity for me for anything that's happened in my life. And so the fact that somebody can read my story and not feel sorry for me, not read it as this woe is me tale, is sort of the biggest compliment I can receive, because I certainly don't feel that way about myself or the story.
And that absolutely came through for me. You know, this wasn't, at no point I sort of felt sorry for you, only because it was like, how many more things can this poor woman take in moments? But the story itself is a, you know, it's amazing. I was amazed at you, but your resilience and really the strength of the human spirit, I think, it was probably a big part of the theme, and lots of other things that I'm going to ask you about in a moment. So,
for sure. Thanks.
But before I do, so where did you start your career in psychology? Let's get a bit of this background as a professional out of the way before we get into the story part.
Okay, well, I'm not sure. It's a little bit of a long tale in that it stretched over probably 10 years. I remember being at high school asking myself, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Am I going to university? What will I study? And this sounds very pathetic, but I was watching a movie, I reckon in about year 10 or 11, and it was Tin Cup. I think a Kevin Costner film, and it had Rene Russo as a clinical psychologist in that film. He was a golfer. He ended up engaging her services, and she was sitting at her desk, looking stunning, wearing a set of pearls. And I thought to myself after watching that movie, oh, maybe I'll be a psychologist. That looks pretty good. But by the time I got to year 12, I narrowed down that I knew I wanted to work in a career where I had a sense of reward after every day, where I got to work with different people every day, because I thought sitting in an office seeing the same old people every day would just drive me batty. But anyway, that led to the whole psychology path. And then I was a very naughty girl in year 12, and I had a lot of fun with my friends and boyfriends and didn't really study, so I didn't get into the course that I wanted to get into. And I went on to do a few other different kinds of things. Myotherapy was the first thing, so that was a 3-year course in Melbourne. And one of our placements was at Fairfield, I think it was a rehabilitation hospital, and we went in to essentially massage some of the patients in there, and one of the wards was full of people still living in iron lungs. Like, this is in the early 90s, and their poor bodies were just so stiff and sore, and so we tried to warm up their little muscles and give them some sort of reprieve, I guess, from how it must have felt to lie like that all day. But there were 2 other big departments in that hospital, and one was a cancer department and one was dedicated to HIV/AIDS. And at that point, that idea of working in the field of cancer really, the seed was planted, and it was something that struck me as something very meaningful to do with my life. So I went on for the next, I think it was maybe 10 years, doing all sorts of other things, including living overseas. And while I was living in Spain, I decided I might start studying by distance and discovered that I could get into psychology as a mature age student. And so started my undergrad while I was living overseas, always with the intention of getting into psycho-oncology. So every essay that I chose to write had that theme. My thesis for my honours and masters or doctorate finally all had that theme around psycho-oncology, and I was just pretty well hell-bent on doing that. So that's what came to pass initially.
So what do you think it was that really drew you to the field of oncology and cancer? Because, you know, for most people, I can imagine that would be quite a scary thing. You know, there'd be a lot of resistance to exploring that. And yet there was obviously something there that drew you in a way that you did pursue it through all of those, you know, research areas and studies.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, so back then, even like in the 90s, probably receiving a cancer diagnosis was the equivalent of a death sentence, which isn't the case now. But I think it was that sense of reward that I was chasing. And so if we're going to help other people at difficult stages of their life, I think my reasoning was, well, what greater challenge than facing death, facing your mortality? So I think I sort of thought maybe I would get my biggest bang for my buck, you know, diving into the hard stuff. And those real raw human experiences and vulnerabilities have always been of interest to me. So it sort of made sense from that perspective that I'd choose cancer. Interestingly enough, turns out I was just doing research.
Which leads me to my next question, because your next, I suppose, exposure from a different perspective to the cancer journey, if we want to use that phrase, your former husband was diagnosed with cancer and you supported him through that particular challenge or, you know, battle. There's so many kind of cliches that come to mind when we're having this conversation. But what did you learn from that as a psychologist who already had some exposure and experience with helping people?
Well, I hadn't quite yet. When he and I went to high school together. He was one of my friendship circle, but we hadn't seen each other for 13 years. And so when we met the second time, I was probably doing fourth year, I think. And he had come home from New South Wales. He'd just had his diagnosis and initial surgery, and we met again. And that's when the sparks flew and the relationship started. So I'd already started this path, and I didn't really, but, you know, saw this as, wow, look at this awesome opportunity to get an almost first-hand experience. Well, definitely first-hand experience as somebody's support person or carer, while he was going through quite horrendous chemotherapy and more surgeries and things for testicular cancer. And I think at that time it just added to it fueled my fire in my belly that this was really what I wanted to do. And I guess it exposed me to the emotional roller coaster that comes along with receiving such a diagnosis and all of the survivorship issues that came afterward as well. So it was sort of happening hand in hand as I was heading into my doctorate training, and, yeah, it gave me really great insight, but still not as much as I would have thought. But that was to come, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, interesting that it kind of confirmed your career choice, perhaps, gave you that little bit of extra insight. But then, of course, what happened next?
Yeah, well, so it was 8 years after his cancer diagnosis that I received mine. But in the meantime, I'd finished my studies and had started working at a children's cancer hospital and sort of specialising in that area in private practice. So I'd met quite a few young women in private practice who were diagnosed with breast cancer. That led to a bit of hypervigilance in myself, going to the doctor fairly frequently, finding lumps and bumps, only to obviously be told, you know, you're too young, there's no family history. My GP was kind enough to send me once every 6 months for an ultrasound just for peace of mind, but that ultimately ended up being just so anxiety-provoking, and it always ended up being, nothing, or a cyst or something like that, I stopped checking for a couple of years until one random day when I did find another lump accidentally and was going to the doctor with a broken foot, and just sort of casually at the end of that consult said, "Oh, would you mind just having a little feel of this lump?" And then that started that ball rolling, and that lump ended up being my first breast cancer diagnosis.
And that anxiety is, I think it's probably an anxiety that we all feel at some level, because we know of the need to be aware, to check. We get these messages, breast cancer is one of the more commonly discussed, perhaps, forms of cancer, one of the more prevalent forms of cancer for women. We have, cricket pitches covered in pink. There's a lot of education and awareness, but that does increase our anxiety levels. And I have to admit that even while I was reading your book, I was starting to feel anxious about myself. When did I last check? Should I be checking? I've had scares in the past. Do I need to go back? And all of that is constantly there. So I can only imagine that, with what drove that vigilance for you, or that hypervigilance. And then...
Yeah, and these women who are my age, and it's happening to them. And so, yes, it was a very real possibility, and in my face a little bit more. And you would know yourself working in psychology, we get a bit of a skewed perception, I think, about, how often things are happening for people because of who we're talking to and the stories we're hearing. So that certainly distorted my perception. But then maybe that was a good thing, because ultimately I would probably not have been checking and therefore not following up. And early intervention saves lives. But that death anxiety is, I've read a lot about that since, and I think a lot about that, and I see that in the majority of my clients. And most anxieties can relate indirectly back to a death anxiety, so it makes sense. But even going through my own experience and the people in my inner circle that were so confronted by that close degree of separation, me getting cancer, so much so that ended friendships in some cases because they couldn't deal with how confronting that was. It's a really interesting phenomena, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. Even the term death anxiety, that is confronting in itself, isn't it?
I just throw that out there, death anxiety.
I don't think it was really a term. I completely understand. Well, I probably don't completely understand in any intricate way, certainly not from a psychological point of view, but, reading that phrase in your book about death anxiety, it's like, well, okay, yeah, we're all a bit afraid of death, but how much that drives how we behave in life.
Yeah. Well, if you've ever read any of, I think it's Irvin Yalom's work on death anxiety, it's just fascinating. And to listen to him talk about it and relate it back to, our very survival and our, that primal need for survival and fight and flight and all of those things. Like it's really quite fascinating. And once you've had a little bit of a read about that, you start to see it everywhere. You can make those connections.
And I think, well, you said for you that actually did end friendships because people found that level of anxiety, that immediate confrontation, I guess, of death and their own mortality and the mortality of the people around them. You and I can say, oh, it's so fascinating, it's so interesting, and do all the reading. But obviously for some people it is beyond their immediate capacity to cope.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we all cope differently. And you said at the beginning about reading my book, and it's not a sad, necessarily heavy read, but that, I just count myself lucky as someone who can adapt to adversity and, use approach coping. Fun. I didn't cope well all the time. Obviously, there were ups and downs in my coping. And I did at the book launch, we had this wonderful event where my oncologist agreed to sit on a couch with me at the front of a massive theatre full of 500 plus people. And we sort of did a you can't ask that kind of interview with one another. And in that, she told me how she didn't think I coped at all.
Oh,
And
really?
you should have seen my surprise. What do you mean you don't think I coach? I'm a psychologist. Of course I cope well. And of course I didn't cope well, and I couldn't be my own psychologist. And I think the thing I did well was I was able to reflect on it and grow from it quite well after I was stopped being the deer in the headlights, but possibly not during. No.
Well, it is one of those questions, I suppose questions that we often ask ourselves, or I know I ask myself on occasion, is, if something really critical, serious, traumatic, whatever it might be, happened to me, how would I cope? We like to think that we know how we'd cope.
We don't know.
But no, we don't know, do we?
No. Yeah, exactly.
In a positive way, and perhaps sometimes in a not so positive way. I can imagine.
Oh, totally, yeah. I mean, I learned a lot about myself and my level of resilience, and it's something that I continue to try to tap into now in everyday life, like 9 years down the track. More often than not, when something difficult happens, I'll compare it to chemotherapy. Okay, you did chemotherapy, I think you can handle this, rightio. And so I do the thing that I don't want to do, or how else do we know? I don't know.
No, and that is, I suppose, I'm going to ask you shortly about resilience, but I suppose that is part of the test of resilience, isn't it? That it's only when we're actually confronted with these situations that we can learn and discover, what we're made of and what we
absolutely.
can. I did find it interesting, or just, alluding to that point you made about, not knowing what, or being able to reflect on chemotherapy as a challenge and then use that as a perspective, I suppose, for facing other challenges, because I know you talk about at the end of your treatment doing some personal training at a gym and going along and feeling, still unwell, lacking in energy, not looking like you want to look, not looking like you think somebody who goes to the gym should look like, but then using that reframing technique of, I've got through chemo, then I can get through a personal training session.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's gotten me out of bed, it's gotten me running, it's gotten me swimming in the ocean, it's gotten me facing a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have had I not have had this experience. And so I'm one of those annoying people that really sees that the whole cancer experience is a real gift for me. And I remember, and I talk about in the book, well, the first client I ever had who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she said to me, she only lived 10 months after her diagnosis, and she said to me at the end, I saw her probably 2 days before she died, and she said at that appointment, I would rather have lived my life the way I have for the last 10 months than have lived until I was 80 living the way I had before. And these are the people that really taught me how to get through this. And I completely concur with her perspective on that. And that's certainly how I feel about the way I live life now. It's very to how I ever would have planned it going. But at the same time, I can take sort of the riches and the benefits of that, even though it didn't work out the way I thought it would.
So let's backtrack a little bit and we'll fill in some of the gaps in the story without giving out too much away, because I want people to read the book. It is amazing. You were diagnosed with 2 different forms of breast cancer, one in each breast at approximately the same time. Is that right?
Yes. So I had the initial surgery, and while I was waiting for the follow-up appointment with the surgeon, I had found another lump in the right breast. The first one was in the left. And so when I went to the follow-up appointment, I said, I've found another lump on this side. And he, of course, said, look, it's very normal that you're going to be hypervigilant given what you've just been through, but let's send you for an ultrasound and have that checked out. And I went for the ultrasound, and, of course, well, the thing that I had felt was nothing, but they found something deeper in the breast that then ultimately ended up being another primary breast cancer, very different and unrelated to the first, but a real indicator that it was likely that I carried one of the BRCA, the breast cancer genes, mutated genes. So being a young woman, having 2 primary breast cancers within such a short space of time was a real indicator that there was a genetic link. So that led us down that path as well, just to add some, I don't know, because it wasn't chaotic enough.
And that, I think, was what struck me, at that point in the book where I think you're going through, you did 6 rounds of very intensive chemotherapy. So you're going through that process. You've got not 1 but 2 forms of cancer already identified. Then you're in limbo for a while because there's concerns about it maybe having spread to your liver. And so you've had to have tests and ultrasounds and things and wait for results.
The waiting game is the worst thing. Yeah. That's so awful, that time in between. And they're not allowed to tell you, they're not allowed to indicate to you whether it's good, bad or otherwise. And it's just excruciating because, of course, the minute you get diagnosed with cancer in the first place, you assume you're going to die. And then any other sign that something's not right, you just assume this is it. Because I knew all too well by that stage, by the time the liver stuff happened, that if it had spread, there was no cure for that. Yeah. The second breast cancer was what they call triple negative. So it didn't have any hormone receptors that were related to it, which meant you couldn't have follow-up hormone therapy, not hormone replacement therapy, but a couple of extra tablets you can take afterward if there's an estrogen or progesterone receptor attached to your cancer. So one of mine was estrogen receptor positive, but the other one was triple negative. So that one is usually particularly aggressive and there's nothing else you can do. And if that's going to recur, it usually happens quite quickly within a couple of years. So, there was a lot to think about and a lot to be fearful of. And that fear of death and fear of recurrence is really common and really intense early on. But with time, that obviously gets better, which is really good news.
Yeah, and this is, I really felt that I had a sense of kind of this battle that you were having between trying to use your cognitive resources, your intellect and your brain to kind of rationalise and reason and look at the logic, whilst also battling all of that more primal fear and anxiety that's there.
Very hard. And I turned up to my first chemotherapy and I had my checklist, I had my support person and I had my pink cardigan and I had my mandala cards to colour in and I had my music and I had a movie and I had my chemotherapy-friendly food and I thought, I can do this. I know what to do to get through this. And then, of course, the wheels fell off immediately once the side effects started happening, which was like hours into the day. And really, I just did not cope then, probably until midway through chemotherapy. That was when I decided, I remember I'm a psychologist and there might be some things that might be useful here. And that's when the real cognitive strategies came on and even, mindfulness practice became my best friend to get through nausea. So for half of it, I probably didn't cope at all. And then the second half, I'd like to think that there was some things that were quite useful to help get through. Yeah.
That little description that you have there of when you're facing that intense nausea and you suddenly, it's like the little light bulb goes off to say, oh, hang on, mindfulness, and I think you talk about listening. Was it listening to a song or there was a song came on the radio or a song popped into your head that took you back to a very mindful moment? Well,
I reckon the first time I'd ever, I'd been teaching mindfulness as we all had after our ACT training and probably, I don't know, maybe for a few months, even a year, and then ended up at a Matchbox 20 concert outside in the Hunter Valley at a vineyard. And that night, and they're one of my favourite bands, and that night the heavens opened and it was just downpour. We were saturated. We were all out in the rain. And the band came out in the rain with us and we all sang this song at the top of our lungs. And I just remember that we all took our ponchos off. We had that feeling of the rain on our skin. It was a balmy evening. The sounds of the song, the feel of being in that moment, truly in that moment. And I remember always going, this is what mindfulness is. This is me being mindfully present. And I, from then on, could tap into that feeling whenever I wanted. And so that was the light bulb that went off that day. I had been so desperately trying to find ways to cope with the nausea, which was unrelenting for 5 whole days. And I just remember this day being so, I did want to give up. I just was lying there thinking, I can't do this again.
And knowing that you were going to have to do it again and again and again.
And you have to, yeah. So like, what alternatives do you have? You know, everyone says to you, oh, you're so brave. There was nothing brave about that. You don't have an option unless you want to die, which felt like a pretty good option most of the time, let me tell you. So, yeah, that song popped into my head, and then that was when the penny dropped. Oh, okay, maybe I could try it with this. Let's try that. And I did, and I just had the slightest reduction in the intensity of that nausea, and it made all the difference. It was so good. Yeah.
So you actually, and this is what struck me, and I know because, and it pales in comparison in terms of, I think, the physical experience, but I've practiced yoga for many years, and I know one of the things when you're being very mindful in a pose, which may be really uncomfortable, especially if you're doing yin yoga, you're holding these poses for quite a long time and you can be really uncomfortable, and your brain starts to go, oh, you've got to move, you can't do this hurts, don't do it, stop doing it.
Yeah.
And realising that being mindful in that moment actually means accepting and almost immersing yourself in that pain. And that's what you described with the nausea, and then I could make that connection. I was like, oh God, because I hate feeling nauseous. But yeah, you actually really almost felt the nausea more intensely in order to be able to cope with it. Is that how it felt?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that, and I'm not an ACT therapist by any stretch of the imagination, but it's that acceptance and willingness, and I was doing the complete opposite all the other times. I was struggling with it. I was rejecting it. I hated it. I wanted it to stop. And all I was doing was adding to my stress about it and obviously increasing the intensity of that. So the minute I just objectified it and observed it and sat with it, that was when I got the rewards. So it was really valuable.
And there was a similar thing in terms of the acceptance around the whole cancer experience too. So getting to a point of stopping fighting, getting to the end. Talk us through that. You'll do a much better job of describing it than I will.
Yeah, I can't remember at what stage of the book I talk about that, but I think definitely, because cancer, and something you said at the beginning made me think of this as well. I can't remember what we were talking about, but cancer wasn't supposed to happen to me. We all have this belief that these bad things in life happen to everybody else or other people, and we're there to help them through. Yeah, that's our role. And so I think, I felt like I'd done all this preparation. I'd done 7 years of study, and then my husband had cancer, and, surely that was enough. And then, bang, there I was facing my own. And I remember Dave, who is my ex-husband, he said to me at the beginning that he always felt like when he was diagnosed that you take your life and you hand it over to your oncologist or whoever, and you give it to them for a year, and then you hope you get it back at the end. And I pretty well felt like that was the case for me as well. So I'd handed over my life, and I think I just was in shock. And not necessarily, well, I certainly wasn't in denial once chemo started, but maybe a little bit before that. And then that, I guess, cognitive dissonance around, but this doesn't happen to me. Oh, but this is happening to me. Oh, who's that person in the mirror? Oh, that's me. Oh, that's right. Oh, because a lot of the time you still feel like yourself. And I used to get shocked all the time walking past a window or a mirror or seeing people react to me in a very strange way. But, of course, they were doing the, oh, poor cancer person kind of thing. And so it did shock me for a long time. And then at some point I had to recognise and accept that this is what was happening in my life, and stop questioning, why. Not that I spent too much time with the why me, but I guess the denial of that it was so significant and that it was happening. So when I could, everything got a little bit more manageable, I think, less of a struggle.
Yeah, and I know when you were talking about others that you were still seeing and assisting, because you're still working full-time pretty much throughout this whole process. You're still working with other cancer patients and helping them to manage their experience while going through it yourself, which when I say that out loud sounds kind of bonkers, but I can understand that.
It was, well, while I was having active treatment, I was referred one family, and the mum was similar age to me, similar diagnosis, except she knew very soon soon into the piece that hers had metastasized. I wasn't necessarily working with her, but her children.
Mm-hmm.
But then, in a way, she and I formed a peer relationship because we were on the same chemo sort of cycles. And, you know, I'd see her in the waiting room before I would see her children, and there'd always be that brief, how'd you go with this cycle, you know, to and fro. And then her cancer progressed and mine went away. And it was sort of a sliding doors kind of scenario, packed full of survivor guilt. And it was, quite a confronting kind of experience to have. She ultimately died, I think 3 years after her diagnosis. And, so to see how that could have gone. And really it's sheer luck, isn't it? Whether you get it or don't get it, or die or don't die, or so I'm not sure. I can't remember what your question was. I don't.
That's okay. But that notion of luck kind of struck me too, because so you found out that you do carry the genetic mutation that makes breast cancer far more likely, and also associated ovarian cancer.
Yes.
And so you and your sister and your dad went away and had the genetic counselling.
Yes, we did. Yes.
And that was to understand, well, at that stage you didn't know, so you found out that you had the mutation, and then they wanted to find out as well whether or not they carried it.
And we can't sort of talk about the results because some families still don't want to know about that, and they're choosing not to read the book. And I try to get them not to listen to these interviews and things, but they seem to like to listen to them for some reason. Yes, so that's, for me, I think it's one thing to have cancer and then find out you carry the BRCA mutation. And it was a relief, because then I had a cause. Then I could understand why. And then I didn't have to worry about, was it something I did? Is there something I should stop doing? And a lot of the risk factors that related to me were around being childless and not having breastfed. And I wanted to have children. And so that was a very difficult pill to swallow. And so to find out actually there was always going to be a super, super highly likely that I would get breast cancer was a really good thing for me. But then to see my sister have to be confronted with the decision of if she also was positive, she wasn't, thank goodness, would she choose to have prophylactic surgery, you know, and cut off healthy body tissue breasts? I just couldn't even fathom what that must be like, that decision to have to make. So luckily she didn't have to make it. But, it was quite a harrowing experience for our family. And my mum is one of those anxious people who did not want to know. And so she didn't get tested, just my dad did. So, but also a beautiful, not beautiful, but I don't know, just one of those opportunities where you as a family and your bond is just so solid, and something that can never be, you know, I don't know, you go through something like that together and it really gets tested, and for us it was a really positive thing.
And you mentioned that connection has been something that helped you enormously and something that you're passionate about as a psychologist. And I know that really came through very strongly for me in the book, in part because within the text you have these lovely vignettes which are letters to your nan, who had passed away already several years prior to this point. Was this a journal that you were keeping at the time, and you sort of wrote it in the form of these letters?
Yeah, absolutely. So she and I were super close. She was always my confidant. She would have been the person I would have leaned on the most had she been around. I had moved back from New South Wales to our hometown where she had lived, and everything reminded me of her. And I'd been given this beautiful journal as a gift, and I started writing letters to her. And that was my way of sort of processing, the day-to-day ins and outs of what was happening in my life. And once and it was really helpful actually to me. And at the end of active treatment, and I was no longer writing as much, I really missed the writing process, and joined a writing class online and was in there for 3 years. And the book sort of evolved from that and from those letters. And so it made sense to me that they're actual excerpts, I guess, from the letters word for word that I wrote to her. And she's so important to me. I don't know if my genetic stuff came from her, but I come from her. And I love those parts of the story. And they were a nice way, like the journal writing, the letter writing to her did allow me to feel connected to her. It allowed me to tap into memories very clearly, where I felt like I knew what she would say and I knew what she would do to make me or help me feel better. And it was really, really powerful coping tool for me.
Therapeutic. Well, we know that there's lots of benefits in, therapeutic benefits in writing things down, but it was that, for me, that connection to her and, as the reader, getting that little bit of insight into what was going on in your mind in a way that was less narration and more personal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And somebody asked me at one of the author talks I did recently, what would she have said about the book? And I said, she would have said that I swear too much. She would have said that I should not talk about my vagina so openly to strangers. And she would have probably had trouble verbalising that she was proud, but I know that she would have been.
Yeah, which is lovely. And there's lots of other stories of connection in there. I mean, all the way through, you just have this wonderful network of supporters, family, friends. Well, I think the part that made me tear up when I was reading it was actually you had friends coming down from New South Wales and you really wanted your sister and brother-in-law to put them up.
Oh, yeah.
At their place because you were living with your parents. There was no way, and you wanted it to be easy for friends to come and stay, but they sort of hadn't offered and you were feeling frustrated and you had this conversation with your sister. But then your brother-in-law approached you. What was it that he said or did?
Well, so Andy had lost his dad to prostate cancer years earlier, and he and his father had the kind of relationship that I had with my grandmother. And he came around the night I'd spoken to my sister in tears, just saying, makes me a bit emotional thinking about it actually, but just saying how that they had been in denial, they hadn't wanted to accept that I could die and that he loved me as much as he loved his dad, and that, of course, they would let my friends stay, and everything changed from that point. It was really beautiful. But denial is such a massive coping tool, isn't it? And an effective one, I guess, but not always the most helpful. So, yeah, that was big.
Yeah, and that I think that was, for me, it was, I think, realising that, and maybe it's because as soon as you read, you start to reflect on your own experience and your own family and who you have and who your support networks are and how they'd respond. And, so it really, that kind of welled up the tears for me, seeing that connection played out in such a, not an over-the-top way, a really simple but incredibly endearing way. So all of those connections, how has that helped you now as a psychologist, having that kind of deeper? I mean, we know logically, we know from all our training that, human connection and social support is really important, but you've experienced that at a different level from a really different perspective. How's that helped you as a psych?
Well, it's certainly something that I check in on with everybody at their first appointment and in their initial assessment, but also throughout their sessions, depending if they're accessing that social support. Social support and quality of social support was one of the big aspects of my doctoral thesis as well. And so I was always acutely aware of how that was probably the single most important coping tool I needed, good quality, not quantity, social support. And I think that it wasn't intentional that the book shows that so well, but it's my life, and well before cancer, that's how I cultivated my support network. I'm so lucky to have lived in many different locations, but to have formed very, very deep connections in each of those locations and maintained a lot of those friendships. So it is something that I really, really, I guess, focus on in therapy with all of my clients. And I see it, I'm working 2 days a week now in a secondary college. And also, when you couple that with this developmental stage that adolescents are in and the importance of that sense of belonging and connection, it's something I focus on even more now. And it never ceases to amaze me that the minute somebody can feel less alone, less isolated with something that they're going through, the miraculous healing that comes from having a shared experience. And that's the beauty of, things like yoga classes and, to share something on such a spiritual level with other people is just so healing and therapeutic.
Mm. And you had those opportunities with family and friends, but you also, you had opportunities for tears, but also opportunities for lots of laughter.
Oh, yeah, loads. Yeah. Always laughter, always black humour. And, and that's something that, when I was learning about psycho-oncology, humour was always up there with the top, coping tools. And it's so true. And if we can laugh at ourselves, it makes life so much easier. Absolutely.
Mm. So what have you learned about resilience? We sort of touched on this a little earlier, but, this, and again, people will have to read the book to really appreciate the level, because there's other stuff going on in your life at the time as well, the breakdown of your marriage, coming to terms with your fertility, all of these sorts of things that are just layer upon layer on top of everything else. And it's a test beyond my imagination, really, of your resilience, but you do keep your sense of humour and you do maintain your relationships and you do maintain your mental health. So what have you learned about yourself in terms of your resilience?
I have learned that I am resilient, that I am stronger than I ever knew. And bravery and strength don't mean that you are always able to show up and be fearless. I really learned that what it means is that you feel that fear and you show up time and time again, and that I really learned that when I thought I had nothing left, I found it from somewhere, and that there was nothing that was too much for me to handle. No matter what got thrown at me, I was able to stand up again and again and again, and it didn't matter how long I stayed down for, and it didn't matter that I felt completely vulnerable and afraid. But what mattered was that I did front up to face whatever the new stress or challenge was, and there were so many. But I really think that survival instinct in us is very strong. I think as a species we are very resilient, and that is what I love. And I think that's what got me into psychology in the first place. It's just so fascinating to me, and I don't know, I'm just so proud of all of us that we have that in us. It's a weird thing to say, but I really enjoy. I'm reading 'Sapiens at the moment. Have you read that?
I haven't.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm only 2 chapters in, and I read 2 pages at a time, and I have to put it down because it requires 4 weeks of thinking about before you can move on. But it's a brief history of humankind, and he just takes us right back to that real primal level of where we came from and why today we still have these hang-ups and fears and that we do, but how our particular species, Homo sapiens, came to survive when the other three kinds didn't. And I just love all of it. I love human to human stuff. For me, it just really drives me, I think.
So a heap of learning. And what even, I mean, we talk about all those tests and the stresses that you had to face and that you did keep showing up. And sometimes that was as simple as just getting out of bed, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yep, so, absolutely. Sometimes that was the hardest thing to do, to get out of bed. Yeah.
And just start the day.
Exactly. Yeah.
Jodie, tips for people who are perhaps starting a cancer journey or supporting somebody who's had a recent diagnosis. We're going to put all of these in the show notes, but can you just talk us through what are the things for any of our listeners who might be facing some really scary stuff right now? What are the things that they can do to help and support someone?
So to help and support somebody, I think people ask this question all the time. It's a really great question because I think a lot of people fall into the trap of, I don't know what to say, and so I say nothing. Or this is so confronting, I'm, afraid of upsetting the person, so I'll avoid them at all costs. But for the person with the cancer, they just see the absence of the person they thought would come and support them. It's a far, far better thing to turn up and say, I don't know what to say, than to disappear on someone. It's also a much better thing to say, oh my God, this must suck completely. Empathise with them. Not too hard to put yourself in somebody's shoes when they've been diagnosed with cancer to realise that must be a really hard, awful thing. And to try to meet them on that level and empathise with them. And I think one of the things that probably, I don't know that I experience this too much, but you get people who offer, let me know if I can do anything for you. Well, do you know what? Probably take that decision out of the person with cancer's hands and just show up and go, where's your ironing basket? Here's a casserole. I bought you some potato chips. I thought you might be feeling a bit nauseous. Here's a box set of DVDs. Thought you might want to watch these. Or let's go for a walk. Let's get you out of the house. Just show up. I think I'm also not, one of my best friends was just so good. We had a walking date every Sunday and we rarely talked about cancer. I just got to be normal Jodie, and that was a really valuable thing. And that's probably why I worked through chemo as well. I needed something in my life to have not changed. And I needed to have a meaning, and I needed to have purpose, and I needed to feel like I was still contributing to the world. So they'd be my big tips for someone caring for someone with cancer. If someone's been diagnosed with cancer, I think, number one, I'd say expect all the feels. Like, it's really normal. More often than not, I'm talking to people about how normal their emotional responses are. So normal responses to an abnormal situation, rather than them feeling like there's something wrong with them or that they're going, quote unquote, crazy. It's a bit of a roller coaster, and there's loads of grief and loss and everything else as well. But that to sort of just try to go one step at a time. Not when you look at a whole year of treatment, that's very overwhelming. Whereas if you just look from one appointment to the next, it makes it a lot more doable to get through. Use your social network, like keep them around you, because it's super important.
And so now, without giving too much away, you are living life cancer-free.
Sure am. Yep.
So you're fully, I don't know, is recovered the term? I don't know. Yep. And moving, you're working, but you're no longer working in psycho-oncology. What are you doing now?
Not really. Well, I live in Warrnambool, And we have a lack of psychologists in our town. So you can't really afford to specialise here. You need to be fairly generalist. I still am involved. We have a beautiful survivorship program that runs quarterly through our base hospital. So I run the psychology sessions in those, and I love that. That's such a rewarding thing to do. I get the odd assessment for people with the BRCA mutations who are choosing to have prophylactic surgeries, and I get the odd referral with somebody who has been diagnosed with cancer. So I'm keeping my hand in that area, but it's not my all-day, everyday work. I work 2 days in the secondary college. I work 2 days in a private hospital, St John's, and 1 day in private practice. So there's a bit of variety, which I love. But what I also love is that a lot of the psycho-oncology stuff just relates to, well, any sort of chronic illness, but also this life and adversity. And everyone that walks through our door is facing some sort of adversity. And so those tools come in super handy. And when I'm able to sort of try to teach somebody the power of mindfulness, for example, and I'm able to say, this is when I use that in my life, I feel like it motivates them a little bit more to go, okay, so if it can be used in such a thing, then maybe that can be useful for my life as well.
Sharing those experiences to help others. And I think, I for anybody who, as I said, it is a strangely a very delightful book to read, even though it is, such a difficult, seemingly difficult topic, but you do bring all of that to life. All of that, whether it's the mindfulness or the social connection or the resilience or the perspective taking or the humour, any of those sort of coping mechanisms that we've spoken about, without it, it's not a textbook, it's a story, it's your life and that experience of those things and how it got you through, just written in this engaging, easy to read tale.
Well, and that's the whole idea. It's, if one person can take one little thing from it and that helps them in some way, shape or form, then I've done my job. And that was the whole purpose of actually getting the book out there. It's a little bit of a hybrid memoir / I don't know. The intention was to help others. It's not a self-help book, but I describe some of those coping tools in very step-by-step sort of way so that anyone could employ them if they felt like they would be useful to them.
No, I think it does that really, really well and very easy to read. I got through it in a couple of days. So for our listeners, it's called A Hole in My Genes, Genes, a memoir by Dr. Jodie Fleming. It is available through...
Well, all the major online bookstores.
Yep.
If you go to your local bookstore and ask them to get it in, they'll be able to order it from the distributor. It's not hard to get.
It's not hard to get. And I have, I kindly have a hard copy that Jodie sent me, but I also did, prior to that, I bought an online copy, e-book copy, Kindle type thing. So, yes, I can vouch for the fact that it's very readily available. The other thing that you have coming up, Jodie, is a retreat. Conscious Living retreat in May of this year in Bali. Can you just really quickly tell us a little bit about that, because that may be something that interests our listeners as well?
Yeah, for sure. Well, last year I went on my own retreat after experiencing a little bit of burnout from work, and I had to do a lot of work for myself to figure out how I was going to sustain this career in psychology. And I read a book called The Desire Map, and I tell everyone about it because I just love it. It changed my life. But it asks you to sort of explore, how do you want to feel in your life? And it takes you through this process of figuring that out. And at the end of that, I came up with my 4 core desired feelings, which were to feel connected, to feel as though I was flourishing, to feel serene, and also to feel purposeful. And so from that, I was, figuring out, well, how can I do that? And the book, which had sat dormant for about 3 years, came back up. So I knew I had to do something with that because it was a really powerful way of helping others and connecting quickly with a lot of people. And then the retreat was another way that I was able to sort of I guess it's sort of like group therapy. This is a wellness holiday. There's yoga, daily yoga involved in it, but also my version. Sorry, that's my dog knocking at the door.
That's okay.
Oh, how annoying. He'll keep doing that. So my version of how to get people out of their heads, get them back into their lives, but living those really feeling-based values. Sorry, is that really annoying?
No, it's fine.
Well, yeah, so I've got daily workshops every day of the retreat, but it also there's a lot of holiday time and downtime, and it's really for people to take that time out of their lives so they can do a quality of life checkup, really, and hopefully feel quite motivated by the time they leave us to go and put some changes into place for their own lives. So I'm so excited for that.
It sounds wonderful. So it's in May of this year.
Yeah, May 4th till 10th in Bali, in Canggu and Ubud. We're in 2 locations, and it's just about nourishing their bodies and their minds and their souls while we're all together having this joint experience. There's the social connection.
Yeah. It sounds glorious, and we will put a link to that in the show notes for the episode so that people can find out more. I'll also put a link to a couple of those books that you mentioned, so the Desire Map and Sapiens.
Sapiens, definitely. And Urban Your Mum stuff.
Obviously.
Although most people won't want to read about that. Oh, and my book, yes. Please. Please buy my book.
And also you have a website. It's The Psychology of It.
Yeah. That came about through missing the writing process and having this desire to be sharing, human experiences and to helping others feel less isolated with their own experiences. And so, the website came about, 3 years ago now, and I'm just working on a new website which is just dedicated to the writing and my book/future books. It's just called drjodiefleming.com.au, but that's under construction at the moment.
Okay, and that'll be your author website.
Yes.
Jodie, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story today. As I said, I really enjoyed the book. I've learnt so much. Even as a psychologist, I feel like I've learnt so much from reading it. So I encourage anybody who, as you say, it doesn't have to be about cancer. It doesn't have to be. It's about life. It is about being resilient. It's about showing up. It's about coping with difficulties. It's about connection. It's about all the things that we've spoken about today. So, I really appreciate that you put it out there, because as someone who has written in the past and does write, I know that that's a big endeavour.
Massive.
So, excellent big tick for you for getting that part done. Best of luck with the retreat, because that also sounds glorious.
Thank you. There are a couple of spots left, and there'll be another one in the works for next year. So
fabulous. Sounds great.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you. It's helped me to discover your podcast, which I've been listening to, and while I'm making dinner and making beds and all sorts of things, and it's really informative, and I've been really enjoying it. So I'm so happy to be a part of it now. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Jodie Fleming as much as I did. And Jodie had very kindly offered a 50% discount on her book, A Hole in My Genes, to you and to all of our fabulous podcast listeners. There is a coupon code, which is B for Bravo, M for Mike, 35C for Charlie. And you can enter that code at the Smashwords website, which is smashwords.com. And you'll get 50% off the price of Jodie's book, which is just lovely of her. And that code expires on June 30th this year, 2019. And of course, we'll put all of those details in the episode page for this episode on the Potential Psychology website, because I know you probably can't write them down right now if you are driving or walking the dog or running or doing anything else that we often do while we're listening to podcasts. We've also put the links to Jodie's website, her social media channels, and her tips for how to help someone with a cancer diagnosis in the show notes for this episode. And you can find all of that, including that code and where to purchase Jodie's book at potential.com.au/podcast. Of course, while you're there, I would love it if you could give us a rating or review in iTunes to make it easier for our podcast to be found. And of course, that means that more people are hearing from our experts and we are, as a community, helping more people to thrive. There's a link that takes you straight to iTunes in the episode page, so it's super simple to do. And as I've said before, I do read and appreciate every review that we receive. So thank you. What's in store for next week? Well, we are continuing with our loose theme of examining wellbeing within different professions by talking to Dr. Rebecca Hoffman about her research into stress and burnout in junior doctors here in Australia. And Rebecca will be sharing her personal story as well as taking us through the factors that she's uncovered that contribute to a large percentage of our junior doctors not only struggling at times, but also some are burning out and leaving the profession really before they even begin. Here's Rebecca to tell you a little bit more.
Up to 47% of junior doctors had experienced symptoms of burnout. Lots are then acknowledged in hindsight. So the main ones are going to be things like not looking after yourself, depersonalising yourself from the situations that you're in, and then things like risky alcohol use or other drug use, not doing your regular self-care activities. They're also different in lots of different people. So then we're talking about things that could possibly be anxiety symptoms.
That is next week in episode 43 of the Potential Psychology podcast. As always, thanks so much for listening. I really enjoy sharing these stories with you. Let me know what you've enjoyed perhaps today. I would love to hear from you. You can drop me a line at any time at ellenjackson@potential.com.au. But in the meantime, go forth and thrive and flourish. And I look forward to seeing you next week.